Hello and welcome back to daxsdeviants. Today I am once again joined by the fantastic Dr. Sprott, who you will have seen from episode 1. So thank you very much for coming back and agreeing to talk to me. Most people have been scared away by this point, so I'm quite glad you've decided to return.
I'm very glad to be back.
Well, I'm glad to have you back. So today we are going to be discussing the topic of understanding your kinks. And for that, we're going to be looking at another two of your papers, which is BDSM, orientation or leisure, and the structure of kink identity. These are both really interesting papers that I've read over. And I think the one that I was more kind of drawn into was the structure of kink identity. We briefly talked about that last episode, where people are starting to kind of use kink as a sexual identity, which I actually found it was a very new concept to me, because something I've always kind of been taught is, sexuality is a scale of straight to gay. And there was, there's little bits in between, heteroflexible or homoflexible, things like that. But I didn't know that, kinky could be a sexual identity. So I'm really looking forward to discussing that with you and getting your input on that.
Okay.
So I think we'll start off with BDSM, orientation or leisure. So would you like to talk me through that paper?
Yeah. This is when you go into the area of BDSM studies or kink studies. Um, there tends to be two major ways in which academics think about kink or BDSM,
Yeah.
and that is it similar to and does it work like sexual orientation?
Mm.
And by that we mean, something that is part of a person that is ongoing, where if, they try to suppress it or ignore it or repress it, that often does not go well and people suffer. Um, or is it more like this is just something I do?
Yeah.
This is similar to, and this is sort of the serious leisure part. When we do studies of leisure, what we're looking at is activities, sports, whatever activities that people do, not because they have to earn a paycheck or earn money, or to keep the household functioning or anything like that, but more like something you would do on your own, freely chosen, that is positive and rewarding, but generally is approached as kind of like an activity focused rather than an identity
Yeah.
focused. And what we see is that this mirrors, in fact, how leather people, kinky people, BDSM practitioners approach. If you go and you grab, a few random people, some of them will tell you stories of like, I've always known this has been a part of me. I remember when I was, an adolescent or a child having these feelings. Um, I can't imagine that I can just not do it or turn it off. Other people will say, well, no, that's just something I do on weekends. I find it very thrilling and invigorating. But I can, I don't have to do it. And I do get a lot out of it, but it's not something that's a big part of how I see myself. It's just, something I do.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is whether it's an orientation or it's serious leisure, which are really very different ways of experiencing and understanding what this sexuality is, that you can still build an identity around either of those, right? Some people build identities as uh, cave divers, or rock climbers,
Yeah.
or um, identities on, I'm a doll collector. All of these things would be serious leisure activities.
Yeah.
But if they are important and meaningful to a person, they can build an identity around them. And likewise, for orientation, if you feel like this is an aspect of yourself, something deep within you that's being expressed, you can build an identity around it. So, but at the same time, it's often two very different and distinctive ways in which people try to make sense of their BDSM or their kink. So we often look for, like, knowing that people have a range of how they understand this part of themselves, and whether or not they feel like it's a necessary part of themselves, um, or it's sort of more optional. There's more freedom in essence around it. Then we get a sense in which people might have very different viewpoints and talk about their leather or their kink or their BDSM
Yeah.
in very different ways.
Okay. Yeah, because I definitely think from reading this, I've started to think about the people that I've met through kind of my own kink journey. And one thing that keeps popping up in my head is title holders. So, title holders I would say it's a very big part of the wider kink community. Um, and especially in kind of sub communities as well. Um, because you have Puppy UK, you have Handler UK, you have going bigger, you have Handler Europe, you have Puppy Europe. Um, Going bigger still, you have International Puppy, you have International Handler, just loads of different. You've got ones for leather and rubber and so many. And in your opinion, do you think by being a title holder that is kind of their equivalent of running a marathon and coming first place?
Um, I would say, probably for some people, it is very much, I'm, uh, this is my leather BDSM kink uh, is an activity that's very meaningful to me.
Yeah,
Um, right. And so by going into this competition, I'm really like stretching myself a little bit and learning perhaps a little bit more about myself, but it's just an expression of this one part of me.
yeah,
Um, and other people who might have a more orientation approach to their leather sexuality, or to their kink or BDSM, might instead think, well, this is about service back to the community. This is more of like pushing me to express myself as fully and completely as I can. Um, so they may talk about it more in terms of the meaning of it, uh, in terms of personal growth or in terms of community,
yeah,
more than someone who sees it as like a serious leisure activity. So again, and we know that people who run for titles have a lot of very different motivations for doing so. So there really is you can, if you listen for it, you can hear things which fit more of an orientation kind of approach, and uh, uh, words, and a viewpoint that really fits more of a serious leisure approach. And where you sometimes will get like conflict is when everybody assumes everybody's thinking of it the same way.
Yeah,
So if you just assume everybody approaches it as an orientation, and then you hear somebody go, "Well, I could take it or leave it. This is nice. It's not central to who I am. This is something I just discovered recently, and you know what? I can do it for a while. Well, it's fun, and then I don't have to be here or stick around because it's not like a deeply rooted part of me." And when somebody from an orientation viewpoint hears that, they may say, "Oh, that person's not serious," or "That person is not a real kinkster, or a real, leather person, because they don't approach it the same way I do." I think that they're both very valid. They're both very different. You can build an identity around either one of those and
oh,
have that
definitely,
be a
yeah.
real identity. But there are going to be times when the two approaches are very different from each other, and um, and that can lead to a lot of misunderstanding or a lot of judgment, that the way the other person is doing it is somehow, you know not not good, not real, not healthy. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to recognize that kinky people have multiple ways of being kinky,
Yeah,
and to respect, even if you don't share it, to respect, those other approaches.
yeah, no, definitely. And I agree with that, that there should be a level of respect between people that view it differently. Um, so the kind of key points that I got from this first paper um, is the dual nature of BDSM, as you've already mentioned. Um, that it can be seen as a sexual orientation or serious leisure. Um, that sexual orientation involves enduring sexual and romantic attractions, identity, and community. Um, I also one of the key points I got was the motivations, um, which was people engage in it for various reasons, such as sexual pleasure, emotional connection, personal growth, skill development. And skill development was one that I was quite interested in because it gives people a new skill set. It allows them to practice. And one of the ones that is it pops up most for me is bondage. Amount of
Mhm.
knots that you have to learn how to tie to safely bind someone is insane. It's one of my friends is very into bondage, and some of the knots that they're able to do is insane. And they've tried teaching me a few, but I have two left hands. I think I'm not very good at them, but it's good fun, and it is an interesting skill set to have. Um,
Yes.
Another one is identity formation. For some, BDSM is integral to their sexual identity, similar to how one might identify with a sexual orientation. And in the community and subculture, the BDSM communities offer a sense of belonging, validation, and support. This is something that I have seen firsthand how well people can join a new kink and be welcomed so freely. Um,
Hmm.
the community definitely looks out for each other. There is the occasional issue here and there, but I feel as a whole, kink communities are usually very welcoming, very accepting. Um, it seems to be there's a few niche cases here and there, but I mean that's just talking from my own experiences. I don't know what communities and things are like across the pond. Um, it might be a little bit different over there, but over here it's
Yeah.
quite quite maintained, I would say. Um,
Mm,
but kind of looking at this paper, it's a very short, concise paper. It's nice. The data's all there, and it's a nice wee one for if you're not used to academic reading. It is nice to just flick through. So I only have a few questions for you on this one. Um,
okay.
so one of the statements I have is BDSM participation reflects the same properties and potential therapeutic benefits of leisure generally. So, off the back of that, can you explain how using BDSM and other kinks therapeutically would help someone understand their kinks and ultimately themselves?
Mm. Well, I think that there's definitely an experience that people have. We've looked at this in a number of our studies that when people start to explore their kink, they experience certain aspects of uh, personal growth and psychological well being.
Yeah,
It becomes a way of really exploring parts of yourself that, in many other situations, you just can't explore.
yeah,
The you would get in trouble, um,
yeah,
or people would, you know, think you're weird or discriminate against you. But so there isn't often a common experience when people find the kink community of experiencing a kind of freedom, um, as well as that support you're talking about. And that combination can be very intoxicating. It can be very um, heady in the sense that you've been hiding this or you've been suppressing this for a really long time, and now you don't have to. And all of that energy that used to go into hiding it, or all of that energy that went into like trying not to be that way, suddenly is available for like trying things out, seeing what really works for you and what doesn't. Expressing parts of yourself you just never really got a good chance to express before. So, all of that, uh, what we tend to find over and over again is that experience of sort of like freedom and support. So, not surprisingly, there tends to be certain key things which lead to experiences of personal growth because of all that. So people's self confidence increases, their self acceptance often increases quite a lot.
okay,
Interesting in a lot of our work, what we find is that experiencing greater self acceptance is something which tends to be really important for those people who are doing power exchange and they are DOMs or handlers or masters or something like that. Um, and those people who are more submissive identified or taking on those roles as a pup or a boy or a slave often will experience a sense of positive relations with other people. Their relationships improve and are less troublesome. They also experience a lot of this greater sense of what we call autonomy, or the ability to really, uh, in essence, be fulfilled and independent and capable and competent. And that's really kind of interesting because on the surface, you would think, well, if you're a dom or you're a daddy or you're a handler, why would you have any problems with self-acceptance? I mean, aren't you already, in a position that's, you know, positive or, um, highly regarded? In fact, there's a lot of work that people have to go through in order to come to accept this part of themselves, as sort of like a sadist or a dominant person or an aggressor, or any of those things. Um, Likewise, you would think experiencing and exploring a submissive identity and having those experiences as a bottom, as a submissive, why would you feel like, um, that actually increases your independence and autonomy and your competency and self-regulation? Well, it's because often, in the way that we do these things in a consensual way, you have to negotiate and you have to articulate your desires and your needs, in order for you to get into that kind of submissive headspace or that, submissive role. So, in essence, as with so many things when it comes to BDSM, what it looks like from the outside is very different than how it's experienced from the inside. And in fact, sometimes the total opposite. And I think a lot of people who are not familiar with kink, or who only have negative stereotypes of BDSM or leather or kink, they often don't appreciate that, the very complex way in which doing kink actually calls upon um, our motivations and needs to grow personally,
Yeah.
to increase in, our sense of ourselves as, capable and autonomous, and or a sense of ourselves as being worthy and acceptable.
That is absolutely fascinating. I hadn't actually considered that. Um, so, based off of that, do you think that people that have maybe are new to experiencing kind of dom sub um, relationships, do you think if they dive in head first, that is maybe not going to be a positive experience for them, or do you think they need to work up to it?
Well, I have heard both stories of very rocky beginnings where people, um, sometimes in some circles in the communities that, where I hang out, there is the kid in the candy store sort of approach of like,
Yeah.
um, you know, oh my gosh, look at all this amazing things that are available to me now. I'm going to go and try everything.
Yep.
And I'm going to just throw myself into everything. And oh my gosh, there's a community. I'm going to go and like be everywhere and, volunteer for everything. And, so there is a sense in which, sometimes people, out of that like sudden, um, freedom, really, to express this and to have that be acceptable, or encouraged, that often can lead to people to perhaps overextend themselves a bit much, or, sometimes not be very careful about their own boundaries. And it is difficult when you're, sort of at the start of like, well, I'm just exploring this. So how do I know what my limits are?
Yeah.
And so I might say, or I might have the idea that, well, if I'm a submissive, I can't say no. And so feeling like, in fact, if I were to have my limits or boundaries, that might upset the other person. And you have to work through all that and figure out that actually what people really want and depend is your ability to say, this is what I want, this is what I need, this is too much for me, and have that be okay, you know? Um, and so I think there is a kind of there are some places where there can be kind of pitfalls or stumbling blocks for people when they're first getting into it. Um, but we've looked at this very carefully, at least through the lens of like injuries and medical complications. And
Yeah.
I used to think that, oh, well, people are more likely to get injured or have a medical problem um, if they're new, right? If they're just starting out. Our our research over the past 6, 7 years has really shown that in fact people can experience an injury or a medical problem at any point. You can be in the scene for 20 years and still, you know, have as likely a chance for an injury as if you were just starting out and you've only been doing it for a year.
Yeah.
So that really kind of, it was like, okay, so whatever's going on at the start, where you can get a lot of this like newbie frenzy or kid in the candy store a sort of phenomenon, um, that doesn't actually translate over into like more danger.
Okay.
Um, but uh, but at the same time, I think what does seem to actually help with all of that um, is actually your age. Some people get into kink, when they're 13, 15. Um, have their first kink experience with someone else when they're 18 or 19. Other people don't really get into kink until they're like 40 or
Okay. Yeah.
45. And what's interesting is that, well, the older you are when you get into it, and the older you are when you're in it, um, the more careful you are, um, which is, I think, kind of understandable.
Yeah.
So it's really not about the length of your kink experience as much as how much life experience do you have.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense actually. Again, something that I hadn't really considered was age of beginning kink journey. I only began my own kink journey back in 2019, so still fairly new to things. I'm one of those that was very much kid in a candy shop. Went to Darklands for the first time in 2020. Not my best plan ever
Mm.
because that was at the very, very start of COVID. Um,
Uh,
yeah, that was a fun time. But again, it was very much I at that point I had one latex catsuit. That's the only bit of kink gear I really had was just this made to measure latex catsuit, and it was because the company that made it um, was a 5 minute train ride in the next town. So I was like,
mm,
you know what? They're close by. I can get it made to measure. It'll be the one expensive thing I'll buy. And if I don't enjoy kink, then fair enough. However,
okay.
turned out I enjoyed it a lot. Um, and I started with a Kinkstagram. It's an Instagram, but it's my kink one, so I call it Kinkstagram. Um, and it was on that somebody had said to me, "You should go to Darklands." And when I read that it was a kink festival, I thought, oh, it'll just be people celebrating. It looks like a bit of a techno rave. It looks like a bit of fun. Um,
Okay.
I forget how naive I used to be. I really, really do forget that sometimes. Because it was insane. There was dark rooms everywhere. There was guys walking around naked. There was guys in full drone kind of latex get-ups. There was leathermen everywhere. It was what I picture dying and going to heaven looking like. It was just this absolute scene. And yeah, it was very much I want to try everything and get as much experience as I could. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
and yeah, I think I every year I go now, I sustain an injury or two from doing too much. Um, this year's one was fun, but not gonna probably shouldn't mention that. But yeah, it was a good year. But I can see it from that point of view of yeah, I was a younger age. I maybe didn't protect myself as much as I could have from these injuries, and yeah.
Mm.
But it's for me throwing myself at the deep end was me kind of committing to it. Um, but I know
Hmm.
there is
Yeah.
people that do not have that mentality at all, and they want to take it a little bit at a time. Um, which I think it really does just depend on how you feel you want to navigate things. There is people that I have recommended the same approach that I took. Jump in the
Yeah.
deep end because it could be helpful for you. But I do think there is people out there that jumping in the deep end is it might break their brain. Like, yeah, I think
Well, you can get overwhelmed.
yeah, you
Yes.
definitely can. Like, um, I remember it was one of my friends. So Darklands has a water sports area, and I think it's great, but unfortunately, I get performance anxiety, so I can't pee. Um, it's very annoying. But he was like the lead up to going to the festival. He was so excited about this, and he kept going on about how he couldn't wait to go. He took one look at it and went, "No, I don't want to do it."
Mm.
So
Mm.
it's
Yeah.
it's definitely yeah. I think that was a bit too much deep end for him. Quite literally. Anyway, moving on. Um, So the next quote that I've got from you is benefits of BDSM included pleasure and arousal, fun, variety, personal growth, relationship and community benefits, psychological release, sense of personal freedom, and self-expression. Um, so based on that, how important do you think community is in helping individuals understand and accept their kinks? And kind of based on that, I'm meaning, do you think community is almost or fully essential, or do you think people can explore and understand and accept their kinks without the sense of community?
Well, that's a great question. Um, I would think, I mean, it's pretty clear to me in my work that some people, their kink identity includes and is wrapped up in being part of the community. And yet, I know I've talked with many people whose sense of themselves as a kinky person is um, includes things like rejecting community. It's like I'm a
Okay.
rebel. I'm on the outside, or the kink community. I tried and they're all screwed up or whatever, and so therefore I don't want anything to do with them. And so, in fact, you can build a kink identity that's in uh, sort of a contradiction, or is really a sort of like as an outsider, that so you kind of end up rejecting the kink community, and that's an important part of who you are,
Yeah.
is that you've done that. So I've seen people who have built kink identities in that way. I've seen them build it where the community is the most important part of their kink identity. um, I think the role of community, I think it does have certain benefits that, in some ways, being part of the community is better or easier to handle certain things um, than being on your own or being a loner or being, just approaching this without really even trying to get involved in the
Okay.
community. And so, one of the things I think is if you're in the community, you do get better education. You
Yeah.
do get, how to do things more safely. You do get a better level of skill. So that's important. Important, I think, for people's overall health. I think also being part of the community, what it does is it does allow for you to have an experience of your kink that is not dependent on sex.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, it can be part of how you build friendships and how you build a chosen family, which, can be a source of important support when you need it. Um, and so there's a lot of things around sort of just some general things around mental health that I think getting involved in community or having that be part of your kink, it does have a lot of benefits. So I think overall, at the same time, I do recognize, and some people have been able to report experiences of trying to get involved in the kink community or the leather community, and in fact, feeling worse off because while many people experience a lot of welcome and acceptance and support, not everybody does.
Yeah.
And there still is this thing of like kink shaming other people, or we kind of bring in, you know, like somehow in some way, some people are better kinksters or more real than other people, and so therefore, there still is a kind of like um, ostracization, kicking people out, or not really fully accepting them. And so here they keep hearing about all of these experiences and messages of how wonderful and accepting the kink community is, and then when they go, that's not what they experience, and so they feel worse off than before. So that does happen, and as in any human community, there's a lot of positives, but there are some negatives
Yeah.
of that people can sometimes encounter. So I recognize that community is not always and only good for people. But overall, I would say that for most people, most of the time, there's a tremendous amount of benefit of being part of the community rather than rejecting it or not even trying to find it.
Okay. I mean, that I think that's fairly solid advice. Again, I'm not entirely sure how communities are across the pond. From my own personal experiences, the ones over here seem to be generally quite accepting. They do get kind of cliquey in parts,
Mm.
um, but I've not really experienced, as I said, personally, any issues kind of with community here. But again, I would say it is a very individual thing. Um, it really is
Mm.
just based on the person and how they interact with others. Because some people generally just do not get on with others. And that, do you think that could be an issue if somebody is trying to explore their kinks and they want that sense of community, but they're not really a quote unquote people person?
Yeah, that does sometimes happen. And I mean, one of the things, for example, that you throw this into the mix, and that is this is especially true, I think, in the pups and furries and other some other parts of the fetish leather kink communities, and that is a fairly high level of people, a high number of people who have ADHD or
Yeah.
who are on the autism spectrum. And in fact, there's a number of studies that really show that pups and then sort of what we call our serious leisure adjacent communities like furries
Yeah.
um, do have like a high number because how those communities work, how they socially interact, how they express themselves, actually makes space, for neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that can be very challenging for a lot of people when it comes to social interaction. So sometimes, again, they can experience, well, this is supposed to be kind of a welcoming place, but I'm still struggling. So maybe I don't even fit in here. Um, and that can be really a hard experience to work through, if your experience of community, it ends up being more frustrating than you expected.
Yeah.
So, given all of that, there are many things that can go into um, uh, sort of having more trouble. And sometimes that can express itself. I certainly have seen it a number of times where people who, for example, have past histories of trauma that they haven't fully healed from kind of start to act out a little bit in community, and they end up being, sort of toxic or, you know, very, very negative in
Yeah.
their interactions with other people. And I've seen, you know, groups fall apart. I've seen community organizations have so many issues because some people, in fact, are kind of acting out from a place that hasn't fully healed from some sort of past trauma. And in all of those instances, those are times when, again, community can be problematic,
Yeah.
or people trying to be in community can have a lot of issues and trouble. And when that happens, uh, there does tend to be a kind of sometimes it becomes almost blaming, lots of kink shaming,
Yeah.
um, lots of uh, lots of deceit sometimes, or definitely people lacking integrity, and all of that can lead to this kind of um, more dysfunctional aspect of community.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, and off the back of that, we've talked about the negative side of that, but how does kink exploration grant a sense of personal freedom? Um, so we've just talked about how people can act out. That could be a negative thing for everyone around them, but for them it could be a positive thing. How does that grant the sense of personal freedom in a good sense and a bad sense?
Mm. Well, I think that perhaps, and this is where, in a bad sense, people, and I have seen this sometimes, that people will gravitate towards the kink community. They see it as really accepting. They look at, in particular, often some like, aspects of power dynamics or very aggressive behavior and think, well, all of that's okay. I can do that here. And
Yeah.
so you end up kind of attracting and this is an ongoing issue, I think, in any, especially when you overlay the sort of hidden nature of the community, right? It's not above ground. It's not, um, you know, uh, in front of everybody. When it's more hidden, then all of that can kind of attract predatory behavior
Yeah.
and people who think that, in fact, their antisocial impulses, right, to hurt other people or to run roughshod over other people, they think, oh, I'm free to do that here. This is part of it. And so they often have very different ideas about what does it mean to be dominant? What does it mean to be in a power exchange? Um, Sort of distorted ideas about how you what you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
Um, and when that happens, I think that would be sort of like, I guess you could say that's the negative side of the freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, they look at all that and they think they're free to act, in terrible ways, when in fact they're not.
No,
um,
it's very much about consent.
yes, exactly. So, but often they don't, they think they've got the freedom to ignore consent.
Yeah.
Um, so that there can be that kind of dark side to community and that dark side to that freedom, and we have to keep very careful tabs on when people are being uh, predatory,
Yeah.
or when they are being, really toxic. Um, and so that's sort of the the dark side or the flip side to the tremendous amount of freedom that people experience when they come into community and now they can express parts of themselves. Um, you know, when that part of themselves is kind of pro-social and considerate and empathic and and values consent,
Yeah.
then they experience kind of personal growth that's amazing. So I've often sort of taken the position that uh, BDSM is not good or bad in and of itself. It's what we do with it,
Yeah.
and so I don't think every expression of BDSM or every expression of community is by definition good. You really have to look at it and see how does it impact people, how does it impact their health and well-being, their relationships with other people, in order to know whether it's a good thing or not. And still, there's tends to be so many positives that I think it does outweigh the negatives most of the time. And still, the community needs to step up and be better, um, and to continue to be good at emphasizing consent and supporting people's positive personal growth, uh, and not, um, tearing each other down or shaming each other or taking advantage of each other. So, that's that positive and negative side of freedom, I think.
Oh, I think you've kind of covered two questions that I had there. Um, Look at you. You're always so ahead of this. Um, we're gonna allow it. No, I'm actually very happy with that. So the boundaries between sex and BDSM are described as fluid and negotiated differently by each individual. How do participants typically navigate those boundaries, and what does this tell us about understanding kinks?
Well, this is one of those areas where I am absolutely fascinated by and still trying to make sense of. and figure out, and that is, what is the relationship between kink and sex? And it even becomes a little funny to say, well, kink is like a sexual orientation, um, when sometimes kink isn't about sex at all.
Yeah.
So that all of that, I think, highlights that people do tend to relate kink and sex in different ways. And so you can't really assume that all kink is sexual.
Yeah.
Uh, 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 and so some people, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, for example, asexual people really like kink. And it's because it allows them to connect to somebody else in a very powerful and intimate way that doesn't necessarily involve, genitals and orgasm. When you're having a really good BDSM scene, whether or not it involves orgasm or genitals in the way we normally think of sex becomes beside the point. You're having such an amazing experience. Um, it can be erotic. It can also not be erotic. Um, if it's erotic, it can include sex, but it doesn't have to. Some people think that doing a BDSM scene and then doing like sexual behavior comes from the same energy or the same place. They're just two expressions of the same thing. Other people think that kink and BDSM and sex are two completely different headspaces and two completely different energies. They don't like to mix them for a lot of interesting reasons. Most people, do think, in my own work, I think it's about 80%, maybe 85% of people do experience kink and sex as blending. Kink is sort of foreplay to sex, or it's an aphrodisiac, or it's a spice that you add to your sex to make it, a little hotter. Um, but definitely there's a blend of some sort. And so it becomes not terribly um, wrong to think that kink and sex are, of course, related. And so therefore, we can say it's like it's an alternative sexuality, or it's kind of like a sexual orientation, um, because there's a lot that supports that. But to think that that is true for everybody, or it's true for every kink encounter, would also be wrong. That would be like, well, no, there are lots of people who don't experience their BDSM as being related to their kink, to their sex at all.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we have to kind of be ready and appreciate that people's understanding and experience of the relationship between kink and sex can be really different, and different from you, different from even most people that in the kink community. Um, you know, eh, there's some indication that, for example, uh, there are differences dependent upon which segment or part of the kink community you're looking at or you're a part of. So, for example, gay leathermen, gay kinksters, gay men who are doing kink are much more likely to have a blend of kink and sex uh, um, than, for example, a heterosexual couple, or um, other people, other genders, um, other sexes. So there you see that, in spite of the fact that still most people would think that kink and sex go together, or they blend, or one kind of leads to the other, that in some parts of the community that connection is much stronger
Yeah.
than it would be in other parts of the community. So that, I think that in general, that's what we're learning. This is what we're understanding from our research and really looking carefully at how people understand the relationship between kink and sex. It turns out to be um, it turns out to be much more complicated than it first appears, and definitely more complicated than what the mainstream society or the vanilla society thinks about kink and BDSM.
Absolutely. I do feel like, from my own personal experience of reading through your research, it does feel like kink is an entire side of psychology that has been untapped until recently, with yourself and your colleagues kind of starting to investigate. Um,
Mm,
so I can definitely appreciate that it's a new thing that we're still trying to figure out. Um, I would say it's very normal, when you consider late 90s, we didn't really understand the human genome, just as a
mm,
comparison, where we thought there was
mhm,
going to be over 100,000 genes, and it turns out there's a lot less than that. Um, so I think this is just the next part of discovering the human psyche. Um,
mm,
but off the back of that, the paper highlights that BDSM can be seen as both a sexual orientation and a serious leisure activity. How does this dual perspective help individuals better understand their own kinks?
mm. Well, I think at first, what it does is it highlights that there's no one right way to do kink, and or one right way to experience fetish or BDSM. And and I think that often when people are just starting out, in particular, they might have a lot of misconceptions, or they might have, you know, uh, if all of your education is based upon BDSM porn, you're going to have a very particular view of BDSM and why people do it and what it does for people,
Yeah, yeah,
that does not reflect this huge range of how people build their kink identities and what it means to them. So I think in part that just opening up what's possible um, can become a part of that experience of freedom, that experience of maybe being able to find your place and how you relate to other people, because there are so many different ways to do it. So I think that's like probably the first thing, is the more that you explore, the more you connect, the more that you really look at things and get more information and experience, the more you come to appreciate that there are so many different ways to do this, and and they're all valid, and they're all, other people experience it in like that way. Even if most kinksters don't do it that way, you will find some.
yeah,
There are certain fetishes and certain kink behaviors that are still relatively rare, but you can still find other people who are kind of wired that way or into that kink. And um and so I think that all of that really points to uh just expanding your mind of as to what's possible when it comes to your own sexuality, your own personhood.
definitely. And with that, with how common kinks are within the LGBT community, Why are kinks like BDSM still discriminated against or taboo?
I think that in part, some people would say there's always going to be this natural human tendency to think um, that there's a good way and a bad way to do sexuality.
Yeah,
There's a good
yeah,
way and a bad way to do kink. And so those people out there are like too far, too much, um, dangerous. So I think part of it is an attempt uh, to feel like, you know, there is a right way, or this is the way to do it. And so I think kink then becomes the mysterious, and dangerous other
mhm,
in all of that. Um, Regardless of how common those fantasies are, or regardless of how many people actually engage in, you know, spanking and rough sex and bondage and things like that. So I think part of it is we have an ideology that privileges or places certain aspects of sexuality or relationship as being, this is what's good. And if you're different from that, that must mean there's something wrong or something bad
yeah,
or something sick, right? Or else, because why would you do it differently? And I think part of it is this kind of human impulse to uh, to build community in such a way that you think the way that you do things is the best way.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so I think that that's part of it. The other big part of it is, though, so much of this is underground. So much of this is hidden. Um, you know, there are so many people who won't come out or don't come out as kinky, um, and sometimes for very good reason. It's dangerous,
yeah,
and you can risk a lot of things because of this stigma and this discrimination, this talking about kink as somehow a spoiled sexuality that's not good for people. So I think that all of that means that um, we have to work really, really hard. We all grow up in a culture that can either completely ignores kink, or if it does show it, it tends to show it as kind of like a dangerous and antisocial thing. Um, and who wants to be that person, you know?
yeah,
Um, so I that's a big part of it, is some basic aspects of human psychology. The fact that things are hidden because uh, there is discrimination and there is prejudice, and but that tends to kind of keep the stigma going when you don't challenge it, when you don't come out, when you don't um, let parts of your community at least be visible.
yeah,
And and of course, what happens often is that when it does start to become visible, or people start to come out a bit, of course the culture is going to say, well, something like, well, that's okay over there, or but not everywhere, or you know that's not serious. So yeah, it's fine that you dabble in that, but don't actually build a life around it, because that would mean somehow in some way it's more important than what we think it is.
yeah,
So there are lots of dynamics like that that kind of keep it. keep the stigma going, keep the discrimination like going and acceptable. So we tend to also have to find each other and then build a counterculture that basically says, hey, you know what? Doing all of this stuff is actually good, or there's a good way to do it, rather than seeing it as like violence or
Yeah.
as somehow in some way damaging. So it takes a lot to build that so that you have that space, let alone, try to take on the whole world and basically tell the whole world you're wrong.
Yep.
That's a big job.
Oh, yeah. Like, personally, I've been wearing a chain around my neck since May 2022. Um, and I wear it all the time. I wear it to bed. Um,
Mm,
if I'm going out, I wear it to work. It's part of me. I mean, you can hear it. It's constantly on my neck. Um,
mm,
and the amount of times that I have been questioned by people, why are you wearing that around your neck? And it's like,
mm,
well, do I go into the full detail of, it's part of my identity, it's part of who I am, or do I just go with the default response of it looks good and I like how it feels? It's and it's one of these difficult ones because you really do have to, on the spot, kind of work out what kind of person you're explaining this to and how they're going
mm,
to perceive that. Um, because you could meet a fellow Kinkster and you can explain in detail, I identify as mostly a sub, so I like having my chain around to show that I am submissive, easy to kind of interact with, and you previously told me to get on my knees. I can't do that anymore because I've got arthritis. I would do so in a heartbeat, sort of thing. Um, but if I'm talking to, for instance, if I'm working and I'm talking to a client or that, I would just tell them, it's part of my style. It's how I have individuality out and about because wearing a work uniform, things like that, you don't really get much of that. So I do think there is, when explaining kink, you do have to kind of sometimes dodge around it, which is kind of sad, especially in this day and age where things should be
mm.
celebrated. Um, but I think we should stop talking about my fashion choices and
Okay.
move on to the next paper.
Yeah.
So we're now talking about your paper on the structure of kink identity, four key themes within a world of complexity. Um, so I've got it summarized as the paper explores the multifaceted nature of kink identity, identifying four central themes that emerge within this complex landscape. It highlights how individuals who engage in kink navigate their identities, communities, and experiences, providing a nuanced understanding of what constitutes kink identity. Um, my key points I got from this is the fluidity and flexibility of it, that kink identities are not
Mm,
fixed, they are fluid and flexible. Individuals often move between different roles and preferences over time. This fluidity allows for personal growth and exploration, helping individuals understand and express their evolving desires and identities.
mhm,
Um, it has a community and connection, so the kink community plays a crucial role in the formation and affirmation of kink identities. It offers a supportive space for individuals to explore and validate their experiences. Um, It talks about stigma and marginalization. Despite increased acceptance, individuals with kink identities often face stigma and marginalization from mainstream society, as we've already discussed. Addressing these sorry, addressing and mitigating these challenges is essential for the well-being of kink practitioners. This involves promoting understanding and reducing prejudice. And intersectionality. Kink identities intersect with other aspects of an individual's identity, such as gender, sexuality, race, and socioeconomic status. These intersections add layers of complexity to kink identities, influencing how individuals experience and express their kinks. So, did I get that right?
Yeah,
Magic.
I would say so.
Oh, it's been
Now,
it's been a few years. Yeah,
so those four themes are community, um, sex, um, power, and a headspace. And the one thing we haven't really talked a lot about so far is headspace.
yeah,
And yet, that's one of those things. And here, headspace captures several distinct aspects. So, some people, their kink identity includes and is wrapped up in searching for altered states of consciousness, like, if a really good flogging or an experience with fisting or something like that,
yeah,
where you could have an incredible sort of out of body experience or an ecstatic moment or something.
mhm,
So that's one aspect where some people, that's an important part of their kink history and their kink identity is, and their sense of self is having had those kind of altered states of consciousness experiences. And sometimes people pursue them, intentionally.
yeah,
Um, other aspects, though, include things like going deep into a particular headspace, like if you're a little, or you're a pup, or you're a pony. If you're doing any kind of uh, animal role play, or you really get involved in different kinds of role play for a BDSM scene, the headspace for being a slave or being a master or something like that. So that's another aspect of headspace that it can become very, very important in a person's kink identity. The other is the sort of kink as a healing and or spiritual aspect, that people find that kink heals from past injury or trauma, that kink allows one to experience something larger than yourself, which we can call spiritual,
mhm,
and so that's an important aspect, that is important for some people. That all of these aspects that are what we include in the headspace part is it includes all that. Now, for some people, all of that stuff is not really important or central to their kink identity. It's not something that they've really, encountered a lot, or experienced a lot.
yeah,
But some people have, and some people, in fact, they can make it very a central part of their kink identity is those kinds of headspaces and experiences.
yeah. Because yeah, I mean, one of the first questions that I've got is 64% of our participants discussed a strong intertwining of kink and sex when discussing their kink identities. Um, so based on our last discussion,
Mhm.
what is your thoughts on kink being part of your sexual identity, and on the flip side, sex being part of your kink identity? It's a double whammy, that one.
Um, I mean, other than appreciating that this is a very complex thing and people have very different um, positions, in essence, on it.
Yep.
It does make me, whenever I'm talking with someone who is kinky, the immediate thing is I don't assume that I know what what their kink is or what it means to them or how they experience it, or what sex is. Um, trying to define those things can be really slippery to begin with, and then to recognize that people can have very different viewpoints on kink and sex.
Yeah.
Um, so, so it always makes me want to, if someone says I'm kinky or kink is my sexual orientation or anything like that, I'm like, okay, that's just the start.
Yep.
I have a whole bunch of questions
Yep.
to come up with, as to what exactly you mean by that, because I don't want to make a lot of assumptions, because it can be so different.
Yeah. And again, this paper is another one of the ones that I really enjoyed because it has quotes from people. Um, I love
Yes.
reading what people say. So we have fetish wear of the kinky style always caught my eye. Leather smells. I like the smell of leather, which is a 59-year-old cisgender heterosexual white male. In this context, do you think having kink gear is a key component to understanding your kinks, or is it merely a helpful tool?
Ooh, ooh. I can point to a number of people who take the first position, right?
Yep.
That their kink identity is their gear. I mean, it
Yeah. Yeah.
is
Absolutely.
an incredible part of it. That's their fetish is that gear, and I can't even imagine them without it. Knowing them as I do,
Yep.
the on the other end, yeah, yeah, it for a lot of people, it's a tool. Often they are, hey, it helps me get into headspace, or it helps me to get into the mood. But do I need it in order to do a BDSM scene or to have a good time? No, I don't need it. Um, and I can do this without it. Um, and that's a very different kind of response than the person who's like, oh my gosh, no, this is central. This is absolutely necessary. Um, I can't have a kink scene without this particular, gear.
Yeah.
Um, so, I again, this range of how people kind of understand this. Is there one right way to do it? It's really what's right is, does it fit you? Right?
Yeah.
Is this what is this ultimately what makes you happy? And if the answer is yes, then that's right for you. Um,
No, that makes perfect sense to
so
me. Um,
yeah,
um, so, while eroticizing power was a common element of many of our participants' narratives, the theme of power itself varied across each person's story depending on the fluidity versus stability of power role in kink activities and relationships. Do you think part of understanding your kinks involves knowing your own place or fluidity of power? I do think this one kind of ties back to headspaces.
yes, yeah, I can kind of see that. Um, in our work, what we have been able to see is that people who are really their kink is about power exchange, or it is about experiencing dom sub
Hmm.
dynamics or headspaces. I mean, those people who are really focused on kink is about power and power difference, um, tend to have what I think of as a more centralized sense of a kink identity, that it's more important or a central expression of their selves.
Okay.
So there's something about power dynamic in particular that pushes more for, like, kink as a sexual orientation or kink as a necessary part of myself more than like other aspects of fetish or even SM or something like that. Um, so I do think there's something in particular about the aspect of power that tends to push for a particular kind of kink identity experience,
Okay.
where it is more important and is experienced as like uh, this is a necessary part of myself. And I find that interesting. And I'm still like trying to figure out, so what is it about power that pushes for a more central sense of a kink self?
Mhm.
Um, and within that, of course, there are some people who identify as like power is fluid and I'm switchy, or, at one point in my life, I was a boy and now I'm a daddy or a sir. um, or people who are boys to in one relationship but daddies or masters in another relationship. And I mean all of that, some people find that the power is really really important, but it's also kind of fluid.
Yeah.
Other people kind of experience it as uh, it's actually not very fluid. It's like I'm a dominant in every relationship, I'm a dominant in every activity, because that's who I am, right? That's an expression of who I am, or a
Yeah.
sub. So you can find people who, are not, I would not consider that to be fluid, right?
Yeah.
But have veered towards one of the polar ends and kind of stay there, um, and will be there for a long time, if not the rest of their lives. So, so that aspect I think is also really important. Um, and often the I should say the less fluid, I tend to call that unipolar.
Yeah.
If you are,
Mhm.
focused on one end of the power exchange spectrum than the other, um, then, or, not moving back and forth, those people do tend to use a more, this is a very, kink is a very central part of who I am in a sexual orientation.
Mhm.
So they experience it as like a fundamental part of themselves. And you don't necessarily find that with like community or altered states of consciousness or headspace or anything like that. Power does really seem to organize the person's sense of self in a way that's unlike any other aspect of kink.
Okay.
And I find that fascinating. And still, I'm still trying to figure that out.
It seems like a very fascinating aspect of um, your research. Is certainly the power play. It's something that kind of pops up quite frequently throughout the papers that I've read. Is this learning about power dynamics and what effect that has on individuals? Um, Looking at kind of other thing that has effects on individuals, this paper was actually the one that mentioned about negative community impact. Um,
Mm.
so I've got it here. So discussing the community in a negative aspect, I've got a quote here saying the single worst aspect of the community to me is it's very much like the junior high school from hell. You know, I've never willingly spent any time as an adult in a community that's misbehaved this badly. It's so much like a bad junior high school movie, I can't believe it. And that is from a 58-year-old white heterosexual cisgender male. This participant felt unwelcome in the community and rejected the community, but states he is still practicing his kinks and having experiences with others. What advice would you have to other individuals that maybe feel the same way as this participant?
I highlighted that, and I really pointed to that particular example because um, it's a bit unusual, um, but not, as you say, it's not all that uncommon
Mhm.
that people might have an experience or feel that way about the community. So, my advice is, I think that is um, I think that that's a valid critique.
Mhm.
Um, in some ways, definitely the person's experience is not wrong, or somehow um, mistaken. Um, at the same time, I think I would probably just caution someone going, well, yeah, you might have that relationship with the community right now, but there are a lot of positives that can come with being connected to community.
Definitely.
Um, and perhaps there's a way to be in community that doesn't allow you, doesn't mean that you have to take all of this, sort of negative stuff on.
Yeah.
Um, and and I know that often what I would say is, if keep trying to find a place in the community where all that stuff is not going on. And I know that sometimes people are pretty limited in what their community options are. Um, you know, I'm in an area, a part of the country where there aren't a lot of Kinksters, and the people who do come together and show up in the community, they're acting this way, and I just don't want to be part of that.
Yeah.
And so I can understand. So I guess in a way, I would say that um, you know the I always say I think it's important to be hopeful
Yeah.
that you will find your spot, or that things might change, or that it's not always going to be this way. And at the same time, I think I fully respect someone who's come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And I would not be the first person to say, you know, uh, oh, clearly you're wrong about the community, or you're not necessarily wrong about your experience, but I would hope that maybe at some point you might try again.
Yeah. Because I was going to ask off the back of that, do you think maybe had he interacted with a a different I don't really know how to word this, a different community, but in the same kind of kink or whatever aspect it was that he enjoys practicing, do you think if he had
Mhm.
interacted with a different group, um, sort of thing, would that maybe have changed his opinion, or do you think he maybe just didn't have good experiences over several times and that was him just going, nope, no group's ever going to be any different?
Well, I think both of those are quite possible.
Okay.
Um, and I think that, I mean, ultimately, I think the important I tend to think the important thing is to be
Yeah.
open. Um, and that might mean that you are um, open to the possibility that, again, things might change, or you might find a different group that is available, and not write that off for all time.
Yeah.
So that tends to be my sort of approach is, you know, this particularly negative experience of community um, might not be the last word about that experience, but you have to be willing and ready to when you are ready to try again.
Yeah.
And I think that if you do that, um, given your past experience, you're going to know right away whether or not things have changed.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And in fact, or you're going to go, oh, wow, you know what? I know in the first 10 minutes of this event or the first 10 minutes of this meeting that things haven't changed. So,
Yeah.
I don't have to be here. And so, but at least you show up to find out
Yeah.
instead of just assuming that things are never going to change.
No, I mean, yeah, I can't really disagree with you there. And would you say that these personal narratives, so when I say personal narratives and individual experiences, I'm talking about going to community events or practicing kink in either small groups, one on one, by yourself, sort of thing. Um, how do personal narratives and individual experiences contribute to our understanding of kink identities?
Okay. Um, I think in part they contribute by um, the way in which we try to understand, um, and this is sort of the basic aspect of identity. Identity does a lot of work. It helps us to connect to other people, but it also helps us to feel and see ourselves as distinctive, as unique, or as an individual.
Yeah.
So there's always this like, where's my place in society, and where's my place here in this community, and also how am I distinct or different from everybody else? And identity is what allows us to kind of do that, to have both, you know, an individuality and a place in the community.
Yeah.
And so the personal narrative part you're talking about helps us to make sense of that, because there is this like fundamental tension. One way of being part of the community is to go along with it. But if you go along with it all the time, then you might lose your sense of individuality.
Yeah.
So there's always this like tension between, you know, being true to myself and also being connected and belonging. And I think we end up emphasizing different aspects of our life journey, our own personal story, to help us make sense of all that. And so often that might mean that, even our personal narratives will shift and change over time as our sense of self changes, or as the community changes, and our place in the community changes.
Mhm.
So it's an ongoing way in which we're trying to constantly make sense. We both need to be seen as unique individuals and special, and we also need to belong and to connect to others, and so to try to find that way is a constant searching, and constructing of our identities. So generally that's how that works, and it's one of the reasons why I like to do research in this whole area. It's an ongoing human need that we're constantly trying to balance, like, all of these different, sometimes conflicting, needs or motivations, or things that we absolutely have to have in order to be healthy, thriving, you know, psychologically well people.
Yeah.
So it's not static. It does constantly change, and I think that uh, means that our personal stories change, the parts of it at least that are important, and that feeds into a shifting and changing sense of kink identity. And it just makes sense to me that um, that this is an ongoing dynamic. We have to do it in order to be happy and healthy.
Yeah.
Um, Yet at the same time, there's no one right way to do it.
And I think that is a fantastic end note for this episode. I think you've summarized it better than I could. Um, so
Well, I've been working on this for a long,
yeah,
long
yeah,
time.
you have been. God, you've put in a lot of research into this. That's for sure. Um, so I think if you would like to, we can mention the ongoing study that you're doing. If you want people to get involved with that.
Yes.
So
We are
yeah,
currently doing a study that looks at kink and the positive aspects. We've decided we really want to get a better understanding of how kink helps people with personal growth. And in some cases, how kink has helped with healing from past trauma or past difficult relationships. So we have a survey study, anonymous. It's open to it's open to everybody. No matter what country you live in, we want to hear from you, um, and it will ask a lot of questions about one's experience of kink as a positive force in your life. And we're currently about halfway through enrolling people in the study before we, have enough participants that we can investigate what's going on. But we're very happy about it because while in the field and certainly in the kink community there's been a fair amount of people acknowledging and discussing how kink has been a positive force in their life. There's not been a lot of large scale studies of it. And so we're really happy to be doing one of the first ones.
yeah, and it sounds like it's going to be a really interesting study, and I'm really excited to see the paper on it. So I will put a link to the study in the podcast episodes. So for anyone that is listening in, it will be down below. I will also be putting a link to it on my blog, which you can find at daxsdeviants.com. Um, and I think that is pretty much us for this episode. So thank you once again for joining me, Dr. Sprott. Um, I absolutely love having you on the show. You are an absolutely fantastic guest. You are so incredibly knowledgeable. Um, and I'm looking forward to another one because we've got a third one to do. I can't believe I put that it was going to be 3 45-minute episodes and how wrong I was. I'm, I
There's a
know,
lot to talk about.
yeah, like I was like, okay, I'm asking, you know, like, I don't think I'm asking enough questions. Like, is this going to be enough for 45 minutes? And that is now both times I've been like, yep, that was more than 45. But I know it for the future now that I should be more careful when talking to experts that have a lot of knowledge. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me again. And I hope to see you again next time.
All right, sounds good.